Hey guys, this is Luke Humphrey. Welcome back to the Luke Humphrey Running Podcast. I appreciate all the great feedback from the last one. Yes, the audio is much better, right? And so I think that will be a much better listening experience. And a lot of you reconfirmed what I was kind of aware of. That a lot of you listen to the podcast while you're running or doing whatever, and it's nice to have that instead of just a YouTube video, which I would tend to agree with. In today's episode, I want to talk a little bit about the prerequisites to the HMM beginner plan, because that seems to be a fairly decent sized source of confusion. And part of that is, when I wrote the book and talking to Kevin and Keith, we were aware of some things, but other things we were not aware of, right? And so some of it was just we didn't know it was an issue until more people read the book, and then it became apparent that it was an issue. And I think some of it is just because of how the beginner plan is set up and all that good stuff. So today, that's what I want to talk to, because you really, at the end of the day, our goal is to one, make people as successful as possible. And so two, that means we have to make sure that they are in the right training plan, right? If they're not in the training plan itself could be great, but if it's not the right one for you, then it's not going to do any good. So we want to make sure that you make the right choice in training plan and that it fits you where you're at, no matter, one of the things I'm going to talk about is just the fact that, like, sometimes you have to throw out the whole title of beginner, intermediate, advanced, because a lot of times it's really just based on what you're trying to accomplish and what you can fit in during a week, right? It doesn't matter if you're a beginner or not, because I think a lot of people will tell you that the beginner plan in Hansons marathon method is much more like an intermediate plan with other programs. So with that being said, who is the beginner plan for? And I think that's the first place we should probably start. And so, it's not necessarily recommended for those who are brand new to running, meaning that you signed up for a marathon because it was something that you wanted to do before you turned a certain age and you've never really run before. And now you're going to run a marathon in 18 weeks. Like that, this probably not the best plan for you. I would recommend other things. I would recommend doing other things, right? So if that's you and you're listening to this, I encourage you to listen through this the whole way, but recognize that you're going to be better served taking another avenue. And it can still include this plan, but it might require more time between the time you're deciding to start this now and when you really should be starting for your first marathon. Because I think there's things you need to do to get ready to be able to handle what this schedule is going to be asking you to do. And so from my experience, a lot of people put themselves in a situation that's probably going to be a little over their head. Maybe not right away, but it's one of those things where you get 6, 8, 10 weeks down the road and it just is all added up over time, and it just becomes too much to be able for your body to keep up with. And that's when things get bad pretty quick. And then we're scrambling to try to even get you to the starting line. And I think if we approach it the right way, we can take a lot of that worry out, right? And so if this is you, that I'm just talking about being a first time marathoner, what I would encourage you to do is take some time, at the very least, build your volume up to 20 miles a week, right? So if you're starting from zero, or you're only like, a couple miles, a couple times a week, and you're like, well, my kid is a perfect example. Like, I thought she was gonna be running 10 miles a week in cross country this year, and I would say she probably averaged 6 a week. And that was basically her running at practice 2 miles 3 times a week, right? Is what it about came out to. So if that sounds about like you, then I would take some time, build that volume up to, I would start with adding days first and then add volume to that, right? So if I'm running 3 days a week, I would go to 4 days a week and then 5 days a week over a few weeks, and then add volume to those runs to the point where you can get to 20 miles a week and feel fairly comfortable at that. And I think if you did that for 4 to 6 weeks, you could probably do that pretty easily. And then you would be in a position where maybe you could start the training plan. For instance, like if you're listening to this and you have some time but that date that you're going to run the marathon is set. Like you're already signed up. It's going to happen regardless. And you can't get out of it. And you have, say, 22, 23, 24 weeks, start now, but build that volume up and get to the point where you can handle that volume. And then you can at least set yourself up for when you get to doing workouts in the beginner plan, you're going to be in a much better situation to handle it. Because now the volume itself isn't new. You're used to the volume. The only new thing that would be adding would be intensity. And it's when we're adding both volume and intensity at the same time that things can go pretty sour in a few weeks, right? Like usually can handle it for 2 to 4 weeks. And then it's just, you've kind of reached that breaking point where it's just not tolerable anymore, right? So the better option would be, though, is if there's not a date set now, take your time, build that volume to like 20 miles a week, like we talked about, and then do a training segment, like where you're doing a 5K would be the simplest thing to do, right? Train for a 5K, run that 5K, because then you're going to introduce yourself, to more volume. You're going to introduce yourself to newer things in training, like some longer runs, some repeats on the track, some threshold runs, things like that. You're going to get more accustomed with that. So it's not necessarily about running the 5K itself, but it's more about learning the different variables in training and being able to apply those in training so that when you come to the marathon, which is much more important to you, then you'd be more prepared to be able to handle that. And you're going to know why we're doing certain things, right? And it's going to be much easier to apply to yourself than if we're just throwing you into it all at once. And so it's a lot to ask of somebody to learn all these new things that they're not necessarily accustomed to, and then add all these things in their training that's probably going to be too much and a little bit of overload for them. And it really doesn't set you up for a good chance to be successful in the marathon. So that would be the more, and then you can use that 5K that you race, and you can use the time from that or whatever you decide to race. And then you can set established time to start training for the marathon. You'll give yourself a much better baseline to kind of know at least where to start on for a goal time, right? So, you run a 5K in X amount of time and you throw it into a chart and it says, well, I can run a 4:30 marathon. Okay, well, that's a great place to start. We can throw that training in and we can set our paces based off that 4:30 marathon. And then we can adjust accordingly based on how you handle that, right? So it just makes more sense to do it that way. But I get that you might be behind the 8 ball on this and you've already signed up, and now you're like, oh man, I've got to figure this out real quick. And so that's the option would be to just at least build your volume up before you start the training plan, and then start the training plan and go from there. All right. So given all that, I would recommend the beginner plan for a person who has experience as a runner. They've run other races. They've run, 15, 20 to 30 miles a week before. They've done different types of workouts, or at least are aware of these different types of workouts, things like that. It can be their first marathon. That's not, if somebody has experience in racing, 5Ks, 10Ks, maybe even a half marathon, then yes, absolutely. The beginner plan would fit that person pretty well, right? It's more about if a person is brand new to running, this plan itself is probably a little much for that person, especially if there's no time. If you're starting right from scratch, jumping into a plan, probably too much. But if you have experience and you've raced other races, beginner plan is a great place to start. I would even argue that if you've run a marathon or two, maybe 3 marathons, but say your first one you just kind of took on a whim and you just followed a plan on the internet, and then the second one maybe you got a Hale Higdon book or something like that, or a Galloway book or whatever, and you followed those, but now you're trying to now I'm more performance minded. I really want to see where I can do. You're looking at what it was in the plans, and you're like, wow, that beginner plan, it might be too easy, but the advanced plan is probably too much. I would start with the beginner plan. I've had people run, well under 3:30 on the beginner plan. I have people who just stay with the beginner plan, right? They used it once, they keep seeing improvement. So that's just kind of what they stick with. And they, I think they throw in a little bit of their own personal tweaks here and there, but for the vast majority of the schedule is the beginner plan. And they just have done really, really well with it. And it fits a lot of people. So that's where I was talking about earlier, where don't necessarily think about beginner versus advanced. Look at what we're asking you to do and look at what you're trying to accomplish. And, if you've run 2 or 3 marathons and your best is 4 hours, I would still stick with the beginner plan. I think that's going to be plenty of schedule to see significant improvement. And I think you can do really, really well off the beginner plan. You could take that 4 hours down to 3:45, 3:40. I would feel very confident in saying that, right? So don't get hung up on whether it's the beginner or the advanced just because you've done a couple. If we're asking you to do more than what you've done in other plans, it makes a lot of sense to just stay in that beginner plan because it's already more training than what you've done in the past potentially. So just keep that in mind. Um, yeah, like I said, I've had a lot of people, and then I've had people who jumped right into the advanced and then they were not super successful with it. And I think they would have been much better suited if they would have taken a step back and they to the beginner, but instead they kept trying to force the advanced plan on. And I think it just, by the time they've done it 2 or 3 times and they weren't successful, they've just kind of washed their hands of it. Right. And I don't blame them. That's a logical thing to do, but I think they would have probably been more successful if they would have taken a step back to the beginner and then maybe come back to the advanced. So just some thoughts on that. And then how I envision runners utilizing the beginner plan is a runner would finish a training segment, right? So if say you're training for a fall October marathon, right? So that means you have to start training in July, maybe June. So what I would envision that person doing is running like a 5K racing segment and be racing in like May and June, and then taking a little bit of time off and then starting the plan 18 weeks out, right? So it's not meant to be really not coming back from extended amount of time off. I'm talking like a month, 2 months off of not running, or like I said, a brand new runner who's not run before, jumping right into that plan. It would really behoove you to have some experience coming into that. It's really meant when you look at those first weeks, it's really designed for a person who just raced a segment, took downtime, and is now building back up from that downtime. That's really what we're looking at on that. Then once they get into that volume over the next 4 or 5 weeks, then they start workouts. So they've really spent that 4 or 5 weeks just returning to running and then building the volume and then jumping back into workouts, right? So that's really how we are looking at it. I do know that, and I don't want to completely discourage people from going from nothing to running that beginner plan because a lot of people have been successful, but I will say it just makes it a lot harder on yourself, especially if it is their first race. If it's just their first marathon, then it's a little bit different, but it's just a bigger undertaking if you're really starting from scratch and then going into that plan. I mean, I have just finished plan, which is in the book, right? So if you pick up the book, the just finished plan is in there. So if you are a brand new marathoner and it's really more for a person who just wants to cover the distance. They're not necessarily worried about breaking a certain time or whatever, but they want to be able to finish fairly strong, be able to cover the volume, cover the mileage on race day. The just finish plan is a good way to do that, right? Because we're taking the intensity out of it and just focusing on building the volume, right? So that might be a good option, especially if you don't, I'll get people who signed up. They're like, I just signed up because, I'm honoring a family member or whatever, right? And it was just like something that they were going to do. But there really is no necessarily interest in like qualifying for Boston or anything like that at this point, right? Hopefully they get bitten by the bug and, they come back for more, right? And then they can go into another plan or they can start getting more serious about training. And then we can have that conversation, like, where should we go next, right? But it does make it hard on yourself if this is your first experience into marathon training. And then you're doing a program like Hansons Marathon Method. It's a serious program as far as like asking you to be able to perform certain things, right? And if you're not ready for that, it's going to be discouraging to you, and ultimately it's going to be not the right plan for you. So moving on from that subject, I think the biggest hang up you will have is if you are new to running, you're starting at 0 and then you get to week 6 and all of a sudden you're starting to do a speed and a tempo run. And it's a pretty big jump in mileage. Now, I discussed in the book how we can kind of get around that. But if you're just following the plan and you've never run 20, 25 miles a week before, and all of a sudden now you're at 25 miles a week and you're asked to do workouts, that's where you can do that for a certain amount of time. But if your body's not able to absorb that training, that's when people get hurt. So you're talking about starting that at like week 6. A lot of times you can go 4 to 6 weeks and kind of survive that, but you get to like week 12, and a lot of times that's when people start falling apart. And unfortunately, that's 6 weeks before the marathon. So if we have to take a week or 2 off to get recovered, now you're down into like a month before the marathon, and we have to seriously adjust what we're doing and adjust what your goal is, right? And so we can really put ourselves in a tough spot in given that. But like I said, at the bare minimum, what I would do is take 4 weeks, if this is you, and focus on solely running progressively bigger weeks and just focus on easy volume. Like I said before, my goal would be able to get you to run 5 days a week where you could run 20 to 25 miles a week. And then when the plan begins, keep the days the same. So if you're running 20 to 25 miles a week, keep that the same and keep the days the same, but just run what you're running instead of like on a Monday, it might say easy 2 miles. And if you're running 4 miles, just keep it at 4, right? And just keep that easy train going until you get to week 6. And then you're going to be fine, right? Because eventually you'll be where you can handle 25 to 30 miles a week. And then like before, like I mentioned, the volume is no longer a new situation for you. So that's fine. Your body is able to adapt to that and is adjusted to that. The only new variable we're introducing at that point would be the workouts. And that's going to be a lot easier to absorb because you've already absorbed the adaptations for being able to handle the bigger volume. And so that makes it just takes one less variable out of it that's going to be new. Because if you remember, what is the old adage, right? Too much too soon gets you hurt, right? So too much can mean running too much, but it can also mean too much intensity. It can be increasing too much. So if we've already handled two out of the 3 of those variables, the only new one we're adding in is the intensity. You're going to be able to handle that much, much better. That's the moral of the story here is if you have trained and you've trained for shorter races, you run at least 20 miles a week, then you can jump right into the beginner plan. No problem. Not concerned about that. If you have done a marathon or 2, but not at the peak volume or the structure that is in the beginner plan, then I would say stick with the beginner. I personally, I don't have a problem with you increasing the easy volume at first. If you're in this group to be at that 20 to 25 miles a week, I don't see a problem with that if it matches what you're used to doing, right? But if that's new as well, then I would just stick to what the plan is saying. The third variable here is if you have not run any type of race and you're a new runner, then I strongly encourage you to start with either the just finished plan and focus on just building the volume and being able to handle the marathon distance. Good first option, especially if you're locked in and you're committed to a date already and you just need to get into something. That's where I would probably put you. If you have time, go back, at least build your volume up. But even better would be to train for a 5K or 10K, learn how to train a little bit, learn the different types of training that we're going to be incorporating. And then also that gives you a good baseline for what you would maybe start out with for your marathon training program. It's the longer route, this I know, but I think it actually will shorten up what you're trying to accomplish, right? Like if you're looking at wanting to perform at some sort of level in the marathon and you have the time, and this makes a difference between maybe doing a fall, early winter marathon versus a spring marathon. That's all we're really saying. Like you can just push that out a few months, do a 5K or 10K segment, learn a lot about what you're able to be capable of, build your volume up, build your training repertoire up a little bit, and then come back to the marathon. You're really going to be able to handle that training so much better. And it would be a much better experience for you in the marathon. So that's it for this episode. Hopefully that helps people. Like I said, there's always a back and forth with like, where should I be with the beginner or the advanced? Is the beginner even right for me? And so hopefully this answers some of your questions. I will post some links in the video description that we had kind of discussed on here, like the Just Finished plan. If you want to pick up the book, honestly, the book is the best. If you're kind of catching us for the first time, the book is by far the best and easiest, simplest way to get started. Is pick it up for whatever you can get it on for Amazon, get it on Kindle, whatever, audiobook, whatever you want to do. But that's by far the best and easiest way to get started. And then you can go from there. In any case, for my returning runners listening to this, if you qualified for Boston and you want to get into our Boston training group, that will be starting in January. I'll be doing a little bit of a kickoff in the first week, maybe the 1st of December, I think is a Monday. I'll be doing like a little presentation. We'd love to have you in there. So we've got a really good set of 14-week plans for Boston. It's using the Hansons marathon philosophy. kind of what I've learned from running Boston and coaching Boston runners. And we've applied that to specific training plans for Boston based on a weekly training volume. And a great way to be in a community who is training for Boston, using the same plans and getting that a little bit of coaching along the way, and kind of do some fun stuff as well. But I'd love to have you in the Boston training group. I will post that link in the video description as well, or in the show notes, however you're watching this or listening to this. So with that said, I appreciate you. If you have anything that you'd like me to cover, don't hesitate to reach out, whether through Facebook or community on my website, email me, whatever. And most of you know how to get a hold of me, but we'll take it from there. Best of luck. Hopefully you get in the right plan, and I will talk to you all later. All right. Take care.